It is just wonderful to be back in Oregon, and over the last 15 months, we've traveled to every corner of the United States. I've now been in 57 states.
The 57 states of Barack Obama. When Barack Obama said he had visited all 57 states, was he telegraphing his vision for a future America? If he was, what would those 7 additional states be? In this video, we're going to look at those potential states and what the chances are of that happening. The number 1 candidate for the 51st state is Washington, D.C. Statehood is so important in D.C. that the slogan on car license plates is,
"End taxation without representation."
That's because residents of Washington, D.C. pay full federal income tax without having full representation in Congress. Numerous attempts have been made to make Washington, D.C. into a state going all the way back to 1867, but it's really caught fire recently. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama endorsed the idea of Washington, D.C. becoming a state. As late as 2021, there was a vote for D.C. statehood that passed the U.S. House of Representatives before dying in the Senate.
Statehood for the district is about showing respect for our democracy. It's not just about the district, it's about our democracy.
There's no place out there for graft or greed or lies.
Beyond approval by Congress, there's a second problem. The U.S. Constitution specifically identifies the District of Columbia as a federal district. This leads some opponents to argue that in addition to the congressional approval, you will also need an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Let's listen to what Pennsylvania Congressman Guy Reschenthaler had to say about that in 2021.
The 23rd Amendment grants 3 presidential electors specifically for the district. The original meaning of the district in the Constitution and the necessary repeal of the 23rd Amendment requires an amendment to the Constitution in order for D.C. to even become a state. Just don't take my word for it, though. Since 1963, every Justice Department, Republican and Democrat, that has addressed the issue of D.C. statehood has concluded that Congress does not have the authority to alter the status of the city legislatively. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy thought it was inconceivable that D.C. would be granted statehood without repealing the 23rd Amendment, and the result would, quote, produce an absurdity, end quote. Again, those are the words of RFK.
In 1963, the 23rd Amendment was passed to give Washington, D.C. 3 votes in the Electoral College, thereby allowing D.C. residents to participate in the U.S. presidential election. Since the passage of the amendment, D.C. has a perfect record of giving all of its 3 presidential electoral votes to Democrats. Based on that record, it can be assumed that upon achieving statehood, the new state of Washington, D.C. would guarantee the addition of 2 Democrat senators and possibly 2 Democrat members of the House of Representatives, thereby diluting the power of Republican states. That will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to pass an amendment approved by 75% of the states. One workaround is to avoid going the constitutional amendment route and going with a trimmed-down D.C. federal district composed of the White House, the Capitol, and the remainder of the government facilities located in the heart of town. The rest of the district could be a new state, perhaps called New Columbia, but even this alternative would require 60 votes in the Senate, which would still be a pretty steep hill to climb. For the 52nd state, we now look 1,000 miles southeast of Florida.
Welcome to the Caribbean, life.
To Puerto Rico. In 1493, Christopher Columbus landed in Puerto Rico and claimed it for Spain. Despite numerous attacks over the next 400 years by other European powers, Spain maintained control of the island until the Spanish-American War in 1898. After the U.S. victory, Puerto Rico was ceded to the U.S. by Spain in the Treaty of Paris. With a population exceeding 3 million and an area as large as the state of Connecticut, Puerto Rico has been classified as a U.S. territory since 1899. In 1917, all residents of Puerto Rico were declared U.S. citizens. But even with the benefit of U.S. citizenship, there still existed a strong movement in Puerto Rico for an independent nation.
A nationalist uprising in American Puerto Rico in the West Indies is linked with the attempt on President Truman's life. In armed clashes in Puerto Rico, 23 are killed, 15 of them policemen. Trouble broke out when agitators launched attacks on the governor's palace, police stations, and other public buildings. Though the island has virtual self-government, hotheads want to sever all connection with America. Here in Washington, 2 of them attempted to assassinate President Truman in Blair House, where he is staying during repairs to the White House. Approaching from opposite directions, they opened fire on the police guards. The president's doctor hurries to attend 2 wounded guards, one of whom has since died.
In 1954, 4 Puerto Rican nationalists attacked a session of the House of Representatives from the gallery and wounded 5 congressmen.
Police hurried to America's House of Representatives in Washington following an attack by 3 Puerto Ricans, including Rafael Miranda, who fired on the senators in the chamber. Fellow gunman Andres Condero and the woman member of the trio Lolita Lebron are hustled away from the menacing crowd. Firing more than 20 rounds from their Luger automatics, the 3 fanatics seriously wounded 5 senators.
All the perpetrators were captured and served the next 25 years in prison. In January 1975, as part of a wider bombing campaign, the Puerto Rican Marxist group called FALN, or in English, Armed Forces for National Liberation, bombed a hotel in Manhattan and killed 4 and wounded 58. Since that time, there has been minimal unrest in Puerto Rico, and it remains a peaceful territory of the United States. In recent years, Puerto Rico has failed to thrive. With a massive outflow of 16% of the population to the U.S., Puerto Rico has been in a perpetual recession. The poverty rate is 45%, and the government has racked up a crippling debt. Hurricane Maria in 2017 only compounded the problem with the loss of 89% of electrical infrastructure on the island, with complete restoration taking over a year. The question of statehood for Puerto Rico is still a hotly contested issue and an ongoing struggle. Like all the other U.S. territories, Puerto Rico has no U.S. senator, no representative in the House of Representatives with full voting rights, and no right to vote for the President of the United States. The vast majority of residents pay no federal income tax and still qualify for Social Security and Medicare. In 2022, the U.S. House passed a bill called the Puerto Rico Status Act, granting Puerto Rico statehood if the residents voted for it. If statehood was granted, Puerto Rico would be represented by 2 U.S. senators and up to 4 members of the House of Representatives. That bill died in the U.S. Senate.
Oh, yeah? Huh? Okay.
Not far from Puerto Rico is a potential 53rd state, the U.S. Virgin Islands. The U.S. Virgin Islands sit about 1,100 miles southeast of Miami, Florida. They're also only 40 miles from Puerto Rico at their closest point. This U.S. territory is made up of 3 big islands and 50 small islands. The 3 big U.S. Virgin Islands are St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas. The land area of all the islands put together adds up to about 134 square miles. All of the islands would fit easily into the smallest U.S. state of Rhode Island, with 850 square miles to spare. The population of the Virgin Islands is 87,000. which is a problem for statehood when the smallest U.S. state by population, Wyoming, gets one congressman for 580,000 people. This size and population probably puts the Virgin Islands out of reach for statehood, but we'll discuss that later. Claimed by Denmark in the early 1700s, the islands became a center of sugar production using slave labor. Numerous slave revolts led up to the Great Slave Rebellion of 1848, where all slaves were finally emancipated by the Dutch government. After that, the sugar business went into decline. Starting in 1867, Denmark needed to provide financial support to the population to maintain a functioning society. By 1917, Denmark was ready to make a change. The citizens of Denmark voted in a referendum to sell the islands to the U.S. for $25 million. In 1932, U.S. citizenship was granted to all residents of the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1993, a referendum was held in the Virgin Islands to determine their form of government. 80% of the islanders voted to remain a U.S. territory.
My vote makes a difference.
But since less than half the island population voted, the referendum was invalid. The Virgin Islands are a tropical paradise. Tourism is the main business and the source of most private sector jobs.
How's this surfing if there are no waves? Hey, boy! Why didn't we spend time like this before?
Because of their Danish roots, it's the only part of the United States where residents drive on the left side of the street. They host over 3 million tourists a year, but still have financial hurdles. 20% of all revenues are government subsidies, and tourism has been flat, if not declining.
Where's all the money? That's as good as money, sir. Those are IOUs.
It has been suggested that the U.S. Virgin Islands could be joined to Puerto Rico to form a single state and thereby attain statehood and all of the rights of U.S. citizenship, such as congressional representation and the right to vote in U.S. presidential elections. According to several sources, this is not a popular idea in the islands. Virgin Islanders have no desire to be lumped in with the financial mismanagement of Puerto Rico and therefore do not desire to attain statehood as part of a Puerto Rican union. Finally, the Virgin Islands are where Jeffrey Epstein, the now deceased financier and sex offender, owned an island called Little St. James, or as the press calls it, Pedo Island. Located about 2 miles off the coast of St. Thomas, Little St. James has now been sold to another billionaire and is being developed as a resort.
I've made a huge mistake.
The potential 54th state of the U.S. would be the island of Guam. With a population of 160,000 people, it's the westernmost point of the United States, and it's the southernmost island in the Mariana Islands chain. The island is 30 miles long and between 4 and 12 miles wide. Guam is about 4,000 miles from Hawaii, about 6,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, and about 1,600 miles from Tokyo. About 5 Guams could fit in the state of Rhode Island. Guam was discovered by Magellan in 1521 and claimed for Spain about 40 years later. Spain later colonized the island and instilled their culture for over 200 years. Guam was acquired by the U.S. from Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War and was immediately put under the control of the U.S. Navy. In the years that followed, it became a key U.S. military and commercial port. At the start of World War I, a German ship, the Cormoran, was docked in the harbor at Guam. When the U.S. declared war on Germany in 1917, U.S. Marines attempted to take possession of the ship. The Cormoran was blown up and sunk by the Germans, marking the first combat action between the U.S. and Germany in World War I. In 1941, On the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Guam was invaded by Japan.
The Navy Department announces that it is unable to communicate with Guam either by radio or cable. The island has been bombed repeatedly, and Japanese troops have landed at several points. A small force of less than 400 naval personnel and 155 Marines were stationed in Guam. The capture of the island is probable.
During that occupation, many Guamanians were killed and forced into slave labor. U.S. forces reconquered Guam 31 months later. During the battle, intense fighting raged for about 3 weeks before the Japanese were defeated.
Guam is again ours. We have at our disposal the mightiest fleet that ever sailed the seas. 24 battleships, more than 70 carriers, 54 cruisers, 376 destroyers, 3,439 auxiliary vessels and other craft, 587 other warships, more than 42,000 amphibious craft, 34,000 planes.
About 3,000 U.S. troops were killed and more than 18,000 Japanese died. Following the war, 27% of the land area of Guam was occupied by the U.S. military, much to the chagrin of major indigenous landowners. Compensation was ultimately made, but there are still many Guamanians that think the U.S. military occupies too much of the island. There are 11 different U.S. military bases on Guam, including an Air Force base, an Army base, and a Navy base. In 1950, residents of Guam were granted U.S. citizenship, and in 1968 were given the ability to elect their own governor. Guam has the highest rate of military enlistment of any area of the United States. Most of these military veterans have a strong desire to participate in U.S. elections, but as residents of a U.S. territory, they're ineligible. Surveys have shown that natives of Guam have a strong preference for statehood over independence, but no legislation has ever been introduced in the U.S. Congress proposing statehood for Guam. There is an independence movement in Guam that is probably not going to succeed, considering the island's dependence on the U.S. military for jobs. One option discussed is joining Guam with Hawaii. But since Guam is almost 4,000 miles from Hawaii, that might be an uncomfortable long-distance relationship, and Hawaii has expressed no desire to expand.
That I cannot accept!
Book 'em, Dano.
About 45 miles from Guam is another U.S. territory that could be the 55th state, called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The Marianas have a population of 50,000 people and an area of 185 square miles, about 1/8 the size of Rhode Island. 14 islands make up this U.S. territory, of which only 3 are inhabited. The 3 islands with permanent populations are Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. Saipan is the largest and the seat of government. Saipan was first sighted by the Magellan expedition and claimed by Spain in 1565. The island natives were called Chamorro. When the Spanish arrived, the population was estimated between 50 and 100,000 people. Disease was brought from the Old World and ravaged the islands, and by 1720, the population had been reduced to 5,000. In an attempt to control the epidemic of leprosy and other diseases, Spain relocated the entire Chamorro population of the Northern Mariana Islands to Guam. During the 1800s, with the islands completely deserted, natives of the Caroline Islands made the greater than 500-mile journey in open canoes and settled on the deserted islands. Subsequently, Spain let the Chamorro people return to reclaim their land, but much of it was already in the possession of the Carolinians.
They robbed us. We were robbed.
Spain ruled the islands until 1898. After their loss in the Spanish-American War, Spain sold the Northern Mariana Islands to Germany. During the early phases of World War I, Japan, then on the side of the Allies, declared war on Germany and invaded the Northern Marianas. Following the war, the League of Nations awarded the Northern Marianas to Japan, as well as 6,000 additional islands. Between the wars, many Japanese moved to the Marianas to grow sugar and settle on the islands. That all ended with World War II, when on the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese army used the islands as a jumping-off point for the invasion of Guam. 31 months later, the U.S. returned and invaded Saipan.
The landings commenced at 0700 hours on the 15th of June 1944, with 8,000 Marines coming ashore on the west coast. But the Japanese defenses were strong. Pre-registered artillery and mortars hit the Americans hard, and machine gun pillboxes and infantry in trenches fought tenaciously and to the death. General Saito, along with his staff, committed suicide in a cave, along with Vice Admiral Nagumo.
Of the 30,000 Japanese soldiers on the island at the start of the battle, nearly every soldier was killed. Japanese civilians on Saipan were told that unspeakable horrors and tortures would occur when the Americans captured them, and as many as 7,000 civilians killed themselves. Many of those civilians jumped off what is now called Suicide Cliff.
Saipan, the first of the Marianas to be invaded, was not an easy nut to crack. It was unique in that it was the first invasion in which an island had previously belonged to Japan, and thus had a sizable civilian population. As the Marines pushed north, the civilians fled by the thousands behind their retreating and decimated army. Unfortunately, the Japanese military command had ordered the civilians to kill themselves rather than to surrender, because the U.S. Marines were said to be all released convicts, murderers, rapists, and cannibals. The population believed the stories, and in an effort to spare their families such an end, they chose suicide. Even while such humanitarian treatment was plainly visible, over 1,000 chose to kill their families and themselves. Most jumped from the cliffs at Marpy Point. It is estimated that over 1,000 Japanese civilians killed their families and themselves.
When the heavy fighting ended, the U.S. had a bomber base on Tinian capable of striking Japan. The bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan took off from that base in August of 1945. After the unconditional surrender of Japan, Japanese troops kept fighting until December 1945, with one group of 30 soldiers holding out until 1951. After the war, the Northern Mariana Islands went under U.S. control, and in 1986, the population gained U.S. citizenship. Currently, Saipan, Tinian, and Rota, and even the uninhabited outer islands have a successful tourist industry, attracting tourists from all over Asia, and especially Japan. So what are the chances of the Northern Mariana Islands gaining statehood? Not good.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
With a relatively small population, it is difficult to justify the representation by 2 U.S. senators and a fully voting member in the U.S. House of Representatives. With a poverty rate of 54% and the previous troubles with Guam, There are not a lot of partners lining up to sponsor the Northern Marianas for statehood.
Senator, you can have my answer now if you like. My offer is this. Nothing.
We now travel 3,600 miles to the southwest, to the 56th potential state, American Samoa. American Samoa is one of the 3 major island chains in the Pacific owned by the U.S. and containing naval bases. Composed of 5 main islands with a population around 45,000 and spread over 77 square miles, American Samoa is the only occupied part of the United States in the southern hemisphere. The main island is called Chuchuela, and its capital is at Pago Pago. First visited by Europeans in 1722, it was not colonized by any European nation because of an early incident where 12 French seamen were attacked and killed. Word got back to Europe, and the Samoan people were saddled with the reputation of being fierce fighters and a group not to be trifled with. After some English missionary work a few years later, Pago Pago became a stop for whalers and a port for refueling. Over time, England, Germany, and the United States developed commercial interests there, such as growing coconuts and cocoa beans. By the 1890s, conflict developed between different Samoan tribes. Germany, the U.S., and England backed different factions. After 2 civil wars, an agreement was reached in 1899 between Germany, England, and the U.S. The Western Samoa would go to Germany, and Eastern Samoa, now called American Samoa, would go to the U.S. Residents of American Samoa, unlike all other U.S. territories and Washington, D.C., are not U.S. citizens. They are designated as U.S. nationals. That excludes them from serving as officers in the Army, and they can't serve as President of the United States or vote in elections, even when residing in the U.S. The Samoan economy is dependent on 2 critical sectors: the tuna fish industry and government jobs. The tuna business is dominated by Starkiss, the largest private employer.
Starkiss doesn't want tunas with good taste. Starkiss wants tunas that taste good. See?
Sorry, Charlie. Only good-tasting tuna get to be Starkiss.
But almost half the workforce have government-related jobs. The poverty rate in American Samoa is over 50%, but this has not led to homelessness. Over 80% of the land is communally owned and cannot be purchased unless you are 100% Samoan and live in Samoa. The society is stable, if not wealthy. The one upside to the U.S. national political status is that Samoans don't have to pay U.S. income tax, even if they are employed by the U.S. government, unlike all the other U.S. territories. In recent years, it's been estimated that a Samoan male, either an American Samoan or a Samoan living in the mainland United States, is anywhere from 40 to 56 times more likely to play in the NFL than a non-Samoan American.
Insane 31 Samoans drafted, with a whopping 5 of those winning All-Pro and Pro Bowl recognitions. That means if you drafted a Samoan during this time, you had a 16% chance of drafting a Pro Bowler.
Some sports pundits have given American Samoa the nickname the Football Islands. Over 60 NFL players have roots in American Samoa. With respect to Samoan statehood, there has been no outcry yet in Congress for Samoan statehood, and there is no strong push for statehood coming from American Samoa.
That's the fact, Jack! That's the fact, Jack!
Unlike all of the previous potential U.S. states discussed, state number 57 is currently not even a U.S. property, although there are significant U.S. military and commercial interests there. That potential future state is Greenland. Greenland is the largest island on Earth. Greenland was first settled by an expedition led by a Norwegian Viking Earth the Red in 984. Viking settlements were maintained in Greenland until the 1400s, when they disappeared for unknown reasons. In 1917, when the United States bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark, we made an agreement that Denmark would be the owner of Greenland. When World War II broke out, as Denmark was overrun by Germany, the United States went into Greenland to make sure that Germany could not take over the island. The U.S. and Denmark then formalized an agreement that permitted the U.S. to establish military bases in Greenland. In 1953, the U.S. built Thule Air Force Base in northern Greenland. That base ultimately employed 1,000 Greenlanders and housed 10,000 Americans on the base. At the end of the Cold War in 1989, the U.S. had up to 50 bases in Greenland. Many of those bases were subsequently closed. Greenlanders were disappointed by the lack of U.S. interest in maintaining ongoing ties. Greenlanders are all European Union citizens, and the island gets approximately $500 million a year in Danish support. China has tried to buy into Greenland, offering to invest in airports and other types of infrastructure. That offer was turned down by Denmark after pressure was applied by the U.S. The U.S. has tried to buy Greenland on several occasions. As far back as 1867, William Seward, Secretary of State under Lincoln, considered the idea of annexing both Greenland and Iceland, but made no offer. In 1946, the U.S. offered $100 million to Denmark for Greenland, but the Danes rejected the offer. In 2018, the Trump administration began discussing the possibility of acquiring Greenland. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton discussed this with the Danish ambassador, but got a negative response. Danish politicians then unanimously rejected any offer to buy Greenland, and that led to a disruption in U.S.-Denmark relations. Since 2010, Greenlanders have had the power to separately negotiate with the United States.
Godfather, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
You can act like a man! What's the matter with you?
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
If Greenland was a separate country, it would have the highest suicide rate in the world. When the Danish argue that everything is great in Greenland, a suicide rate of 6 times the U.S. is not a consideration. But what if the U.S. offered every Greenlander, every man, woman, and child, $1 million and a continuation of all benefits currently received from Denmark? Could that give Greenlanders hope?
Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you.
If the United States made them an offer they could not refuse, Greenland could become a U.S. possession, leading to its ultimate conversion to a U.S. state. Let's hear what President Trump thinks about this situation.
We need Greenland, very importantly, for international security. We have to have Greenland. It's not a question of, do you think we can do without it? We can't.
With the new Trump administration, discussion has resumed about U.S. possession of Greenland. One of the first diplomatic outreaches upon taking office was a trip to Greenland by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance.
J.D. Vance touched down at the U.S. space base here in March.
It's cold as shit here.
Discussions on this subject in the Trump administration are ongoing. And that's the end of our tour of the 57 states. If you enjoyed this video, please like or subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much.
Geo Mac Daddick.